Howdy. I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about the national debt and deficits. And you can see here I have us.debtclock.org's running tabulation of the national debt. And up here in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that approximately every 32 seconds, we add another $1 million to the national debt. And you can see on this debt clock that there are all kinds of tabulations going on in different areas and different related to different particular topics within the overall debt issue. So just kind of keep that in mind as we consider some of the issues related to national debt. So if we look at this chart from fiscal data at treasury.gov, we'll see that in 2023, we're looking at a total of $1.7 trillion in deficit spending expected. And so you can see on this chart also that 2001 was the last year that we had a budget surplus. Since then, we've been running perpetual deficits, which cumulatively have brought us to over $35 trillion in debt as of now, and still climbing. We can see the high spending during COVID and the impact of COVID on our spending. Maybe some of that in the beginning was necessary, but I think most economists agree that the spending that Biden did when he came into office was, in fact, the straw that broke the camel's back and then triggered the high inflation. But we see here that we are on a perpetual cycle, with this year being higher than last year. So here again, looking at a different chart on fiscal data at treasury.gov, we see that in 2023, $6.13 trillion in spending. We have $26.97 trillion in GDP, so that spending to GDP ratio has increased from 20% to 23% since 2015. And one of the neat things about many of these charts is they're interactive, so you can slide the bar over different years and see how the change in spending to GDP year to year has been realized. And so while there's still a slight dip in the spending over the last couple of years, we still have a huge increase every year in our deficit, which means that our debt is increasing significantly year over year. So here at usaspending.gov, an interesting website that gives you virtually real-time information on the status of money incoming and outgoing relative to the federal government. And we see the information here is as of June 29th, 2024. You can break down the display according to different categories, and this is budget function. So we see Medicare at 16.7%, Social Security at 16.4%, net interest is at 12.5%, $881 plus billion being spent just on the interest payments for our debt this year. National defense, 13.5%. That doesn't count all the extra money that's been appropriated for Ukraine and for Israel and for whatever other conflict the U.S. government decides to spend money on. Health is 11.4% at $804 billion. And then other categories of income. Categories of expenditure under the federal budget. And so another interesting place to go and get a real life picture on what's going on with the federal spending. Here we see an interesting presentation from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. From Riches to Rags, Causes of Fiscal Deterioration Since 2001. And this was as of January 10th, 2024, the date this was produced or published. And so looking at this, in 2001, the federal government ran a $128 billion budget surplus and was projected to pay off the national debt by 2009. Since then, the government has borrowed an additional $23 trillion, bringing the national debt held by the public to a near record 98% of GDP and transforming that surplus into a $1.7 trillion deficit. They identify that both spending increases and revenue reductions can explain the growth in deficits and debt, and that it's a bipartisan issue. Looking at some specific issues they identify, debt is 37% of GDP higher due to major tax cuts, 33% higher due to major spending increases, and 28% higher due to recession responses. Most debt, 77% of GDP, can be attributed to bipartisan legislation. Absent these tax cuts and spending increases, the debt would be fully paid off. In fact, we'll see here, there are several charts that demonstrate this point. Here, figure 1, the effect of tax cuts, spending increases, and stimulus since 2001 on debt as a percent of GDP. And we see that Medicare expansion has accounted for some, discretionary spending increases in Medicare expansion are 33%, major tax cuts account for 37%, and then recession responses account for 28%, skewed, of course, towards the end, but beginning actually all the way back in 2008. So some of the 2008 response expense vehicles were never retired, continued to be funded, and that just exploded even further when we got to COVID. The next significant chart they produced for us is effective bipartisan and partisan legislation enacted since 2001 on the debt as a percentage of GDP. Republicans alone have contributed 8%, bipartisan 77%, Democrat alone 12%. But they do note in the context of their explanation that bipartisan items often were passed by either Republican or Democrat majorities, or not majorities, but essentially party vote, and then later took on bipartisan flavor as once something gets passed in Washington, not only does it fail to get rescinded, everybody starts to pile on. So here's an interesting way to consider where we're at relative to 2001. Had policymakers held revenue constant at 18.9% of GDP while spending at actual levels, we estimate that would have been about 50% of GDP at the end of fiscal year 2023 instead of 98%. Had they held primary spending constant at 15.7% of GDP while raising revenue at actual levels, debt would have been 6% of GDP and falling by the end of the year, fiscal year 2023. And again, had they kept the income and expense levels the same in 2021 going forward, here the chart shows by 2011, earlier they commented it'd be 2009, but between 2009 and 2011, our budget deficit would have been eliminated. We wouldn't be spending $800 billion a year and growing simply on interest payments. So here's a bar chart that represents the same data we looked at in the line chart, but both of which highlight the fact that over the last 22 years, both Republicans and Democrats have abandoned, with various excuses at various times, any sense of fiscal propriety. And as a result, we have $35 trillion in growing in debt. We are now funding wars overseas that were not declared by the U.S. We've perpetuated this unrest and disturbances around the globe that we now are paying for. Many of the arguments for doing so have been gross arguments suggesting that it's okay that we're funding all these wars and the rebuilding because all that money is coming back to American corporations anyway. And so I think that we have a lot to account for and a lot to address. And it's important that our current presidential contenders, Vice President Harris and former President Trump, actually put forward some serious policy issues with regard to what we're spending and what we're spending it on. Thank you all very much. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much for your time. I've got a couple other videos listed here if you'd like to take a look at those. And as I'd like to discuss issues related to politics, religion, society, and how in the world we're supposed to understand ourselves and life in the world. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.